So good morning, everybody, although perhaps for most of you it's actually good evening. I'm in Australia at the moment, so for me it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm Jo Fielding. You were supposed to hear from me last Tuesday. I didn't show. I was a no-show because of illness, and I apologise for that, but you simply didn't need to see me in that state. And thank you for tuning back in. I want to start by talking a little bit about me, my group, and my interest in visual snow, and in particular the research that we're planning to conduct moving forward in this space. And then I want to spend a little bit of time answering some of your questions. There are a number of questions that were randomly selected through the Visual Snow Initiative Q&A contest, so we'll get to those a little bit later on. So I'm going to start by saying I'm not a physician. I don't manage or treat people with visual snow. I'm actually a cognitive neuroscience. So my interest is actually in linking measurable behaviour to brain function. So it's quite a different angle from the other people that you'll be hearing in this video series. I do work alongside Professor Owen White, and you would have heard from him a couple of weeks ago. Together we direct the Ocular Motor Research Lab, which is based at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, Victoria. We use a range of techniques and a range of patient populations, and they extend from looking at the eye and eye function to watching the way that the eye moves and inferring cognitive function from that sort of behaviour, as well as using other methods like neuroimaging and electrophysiology. So it's a range of techniques that we're really interested in exploring. And essentially what we're doing is looking at the brain, trying to work out how the brain works essentially, but most often trying to understand what happens when it doesn't work or doesn't function so well. So I guess why visual snow? It was Owen White that actually introduced visual snow to me in the first place. I hadn't heard of it before he raised it to my attention. He's a neuro-ophthalmologist, so he sees a great many people with visual snow and has been doing so over the past several years. And he's certainly seeing more and more of them now that we're getting a bit of notoriety here in Melbourne. What he was seeing is that there were so many people reporting the same sorts of symptoms, but also a range of other symptoms that were clearly linked to some sort of neurological dysfunction neurological syndrome. Where we see changes in neurological function, we can actually measure these behaviourally, hence my interest, if you ask the brain the right sorts of questions. So the preliminary behavioural studies that we've been looking at have certainly demonstrated significant changes in people who experience visual snow. I'm imagining that most of you have had a look at the conference videos, so you have a bit of an insight into the sorts of paradigms that I'm interested in looking at. But simplistically, what I'm finding, and what we tend to be finding more and more of, we're certainly exploring this from a lot of different angles, is that people with visual snow tend to be more susceptible to inappropriate shifts of attention. So what that means is that environmental stimuli, so anything that happens in the environment, is captured more quickly in somebody with visual snow. It indicates a difficulty with filtering out what is irrelevant, essentially. I'm finding that they tend to make more errors. And these are on experimental paradigms. I'm not talking about in everyday life. You're not distracted by everything within the visual scene necessarily. A greater number of errors and changes in terms of visual cueing. This won't mean very much to you, but hopefully if you have a look at the video on the Visual Snow Initiative website, I've explained this in a bit more detail, so it might make a bit more sense. Ultimately, what we're doing and what everybody who'll be speaking to is doing is looking for a cure for visual snow. But what's really important is that very first step is providing a very clear understanding of what it is that's driving visual snow in the first place. It is still a mystery. This is early days in the investigative process. We're really only a couple of years in, and that seems like a long way down the track, but there's very few of us actually looking at visual snow in the world, so it seems like a slow old process. We're not completely in the dark. We know, for example, the disruption, particularly in the context of those visual symptoms associated with visual snow, have to derive from disruption somewhere in the visual system, like I said, for the visual symptoms at least. Certainly not in the eye. We know that visual snow affects the whole of the visual field, and the eyes convey information separately, so it has to be further back in the brain, simplistically. So logic tells us it's somewhere within and along the pathways that connect the thalamus to visual cortex and the sort of higher order visual association cortices. Now the thalamus is actually a little group of nuclei in the centre of the brain that relays sensory information back to the rest of the brain. it does a great deal more than that. In the context of visual snow, it's important to understand that it has a sensory role to play. And the visual cortex is simply the cortex that receives and processes at a basic level visual information. Those higher order cortices, visual association cortices, make sense of what we're seeing. So it's not just processing information directly, it's actually giving it some sort of context and meaning. So it's interpreting the visual information that we're receiving to the brain. In the case of visual snow, there are certainly a few theories that are emerging, and they're not mutually exclusive. I'm not going to go into each of those. There's plenty of literature on this, so I won't bore you to tears. But the most prominent of these is this idea of cortical hyperexcitability will increase responsivity in the cortex. There's certainly a great deal of information that's being gathered and is being gathered as we speak, supporting this source. I think the big problem with a lot of what we're seeing so far is we're still looking at areas of dysfunction. So we're looking at the source of visual snow. Well, I doubt it, and I don't think anybody else believes that that is the case at all. But it's the endpoint of processing. So somewhere in that processing pathway, there is dysfunction that results in visual snow, plus a myriad of the other symptoms that you find as part of the syndrome that Peter Goadsby described. We know from our own work, working with Alison McKendrick, and we have published in this, I think that was a paper last year in that, we found distinct perceptual changes in people with visual snow. The issues were recognising differences in contrast and luminance. And our conclusion from that work was that there was hyperexcitability in the visual cortex. Again, there's no expectation that is the source of the issue in visual snow, or rather, it's rather likely that it's the endpoint of some sort of processing. But it is consistent with this idea of cortical hyperexcitability. There's a series of studies now that have been conducted by Shanken and Goadsby, and very recent studies worth a look at. The very first of these was a PET study that looked at metabolism throughout the brain, but they did find increased metabolism in the lingual gyrus, which is an important visual structure in the occipital lobe. Again, source or endpoint, and that's what I'll keep harking on about. And there's a recent MRI study that looked at levels or blood flow, increased levels of blood flow in particular areas of the brain. And they certainly found that increased levels in areas consistent with that first PET study, the occipital lobe, but also other regions of the brain. So sort of further forward in the parietal cortex, the sort of area of the brain that maps what we see, for want of a better word, as well as the base of the brain, the cerebellum. That's quite an interesting finding. They also found that with their PET study. And more recently, Shanken's group had a look at visual evoked potentials. This is essentially sticking electrodes on the back of the head and presenting checkerboard stimuli to an individual. And they found, by doing that, you can actually record the temporal progression of electrical changes in the brain. So you present a visual stimulus and you can map the time course of visual changes throughout the brain itself. What they found was sort of a late response latencies. Again, they suggested this was disruption to post-processing, for want of a better word, in the higher order association cortices. Again, source or endpoint. It may be that what we're looking at is actually a delay in visual processing. Having said that, beautiful set of information that's sort of very consistent, and this idea of cortical hyperexcitability is really gaining traction. There's also the suggestion that the thalamus is involved directly in visual snow. As I said before, it actually regulates information sent to the cortex for further processing. There's a little group of nuclei in the centre of the brain. It's not only implicated in sensory processing, it's a number of other processes, but for simplicity, we'll just talk about its role in sensory processing. And certainly the work by Jenny Lauschka and her team have proposed this idea of thalamocortical dysrhythmia. That's a mouthful when you're not feeling very well. So changes to the inhibitory activity, which is the output of the thalamus itself. And what she's proposing, or she and her group are proposing, is a sort of imbalance between low and high frequency oscillations that are generated by the thalamus. What especially piqued my interest was something that was raised by Jim Fulton. And you'll see a video of him presenting at the Visual Snow conference earlier this year, and he talked about the thalamic reticular nucleus, and as I said, it's piqued my interest. The reason for this is my own set of research findings are actually strikingly similar to the findings that you see in my studies predominantly, but where you damage the thalamic reticular nucleus. So there's a whole subset of studies that look very, very similar. So that's piqued my interest. We know that the thalamic reticular nucleus acts as, for want of a better word, a bit of a gatekeeper to the thalamus. So it's this sort of, it is actually shaped like this. It wraps around the thalamus, and it doesn't actually project to cortex, so it's not actually sending anything out directly to cortex, but it's communicating with the thalamus. So in effect, it's acting as a gatekeeper. It's telling thalamus what to project to cortex and what not to project to cortex. A bit of a gatekeeper. I find that an interesting set of nuclei that I want to explore a great deal more closely. We certainly see that there are a host of disorders with sensory changes that have been associated with dysfunction of the thalamic reticular nucleus. As I said, there's quite a handful of them. I'm not talking about necessarily sensory disturbances that look like visual snow, but interesting that they should also share those sort of similar sensory or perceptual changes. In terms of where our research is going, it's highly inappropriate to focus specifically on the thalamic reticular nucleus, just because for me it's appealing intuitively. But moving forward, we need to devise experimental designs that are not dependent on obviously finding those very discrete changes like in that tiny subset of nuclei I'm describing, but are able to capture, the entire the visual areas that I was talking about earlier. So from here, any approach has to be multifaceted. No one technique is going to hold all the answers. We're not going to get to a cause of visual snow simply by using one set of techniques. I think it's important to recognise that what we're looking at here is functional change. So the sorts of experiments that we've been looking at actually club together and have a look at changes in function and try to measure changes in function. So what we're doing at the moment is combining a whole host of techniques. So certainly the range of behavioural techniques have been incredibly informative so far, but also EEG, so electrophysiological changes. So building on the VEP work that I was describing to you earlier by Shanken, devising other sorts of experiments that look like that, getting more and more intricate and more specialised, as well as a range of neuroimaging techniques. So in terms of the imaging techniques, we're using a number of techniques, just not one or two. Looking at changes in activation across the whole of cortex and associations between those activations. We're looking at techniques that will allow us to trace individual tracts. So, for example, I'm fascinated by the thalamus, so what comes and goes from and to the thalamus, for example. We are using a 7T, which is a high-power MRI machine. I don't think that's been used in visual snow before. I'm pretty certain the work that Peter Goseby was conducting is on a 3T. Incredibly effective for many of these techniques, but if you want to get down into those tiny, tiny nuclei, you really need sort of the high power and the resolution of a high power imaging MRI. With EEG, obviously the same as the VEPs that I talked about earlier, looking at the temporal change of electrical signals, but I'd like to do this in the context of a task. To see the known task, the task that they thought that people with visual snow actually have great difficulty with. So popping that same task into an MRI, the same task into an EEG, and measuring the behaviours. So we get this sort of conjunction, if you like, of results using lots and lots of different types of stimuli. And I think that's really what's necessary. So then we can sort of distill multiple pieces of evidence. What that does is allow us to develop, I guess, a causational model, which you can't do with the sort of independent tests that we've all been looking at. So putting all the pieces of a puzzle together, we can start to see patterns, sort of closing on this cause, if you like, of this hyperexcitability. It's not an easy task, and it's going to take us a little bit of time, so don't get me wrong. As I said, using the same sorts of stimuli, so whatever, we've identified a range of behavioural differences, so if we can then take those sorts of behavioural tasks and look at them in several different ways, I think we're going to start finding some answers. We're getting to get closer to the answer than we are at the moment. So these outcomes will obviously guide the next step. And they're obviously going to lead to future research and ultimately to treatments. This is what we're all working towards very carefully. The speed of discovery, as you can imagine, is really dependent on, well, firstly, acceptance by the medical community that visual snow is a thing. I think we've all struggled with this issue of not being recognised. I certainly have struggled to acquire funding to investigate visual snow simply because of the rarity of the disorder. I think one of my last grant applications, and I'm not quoting verbatim, but it was a little bit of why bother. There's too few people with visual snow in the world, and we really don't think it's that incapacitating. We don't think that you can collect the 40 participants that you said you can collect. Well, we know now that we can. We had a quick mail out through Facebook a couple of months ago, and we have 65 people now on our waiting list to start testing. So we know we can collect our 40. So, as I said, a few failed attempts. And then what we need is actual funding. We need bums on seats, so to speak. We need people to do the work, which obviously is going to speed progress up. So that's where we stand at the moment. So it's given you a bit of a snapshot of the sorts of things that we are planning to do. These are all underway, sorry. I keep talking about them like they're into the future. But we have started most of this testing. It just is very, very early days. So while we've got a great deal of behavioural data, we're very early days in terms of the electrophysiological data and the imaging data. What I want to do now is I'm looking directly at the questions that have come in from the Visual Snow Initiative. I was handed, there's about 10 or 11 of those, so I'm going to go through those one by one, see if I can answer them. I have a feeling that I'm not going to be able to answer most of them, but I'll give it a go for you. The first one's an easy one. How can someone with visual snow go about participating in research for visual snow? In actual fact, there's very few of us investigating visual snow, to my knowledge, of course. There's a few groups. Of course, there's Peter Goadsby's group in England and Shanken's working away in Switzerland, I believe. There's a couple here in Australia, ourselves, but there's also a group in Sydney that has sort of been tinkering around the edges of visual snow, as well as Victoria Pilak's group in Colorado. This question was from Candace in Illinois. I think we're looking at approximately 1,000 miles away from Colorado. So in terms of physically participating in visual snow research, at the moment, that's obviously fairly prohibitive. So all I could say, Candace, is that you stay in contact with the Visual Snow Initiative website. I think as the initiative itself gains momentum, there are going to be more and more people like myself and our groups that are going to start investigating visual snow, and so that'll start appearing on the website once new groups start collecting data or asking for participants. So Vanessa from Missouri asks, in my research, am I finding any correlation between visual snow syndrome and autonomic dysfunction? Oh, the short answer is no, we're not. But to be fair, I'm not looking at it. I'm not asking about those sorts of deficits. It might be easier to ask somebody who sees people with visual snow as a treating clinician. As I said, it's not something I'm looking for. Having said that, it's not inconceivable. We don't know a great deal about what causes visual snow, very little. So we're really flying in the dark here. And that was borne out in the conference that was run in May this year in San Francisco. The questions and answers afterwards I found incredibly difficult because from my perspective the answer was always we don't know yet. It's a matter of watch this space. This research is really, really in its infancy, and it is hugely embarrassing to keep saying we don't know. We can take some educated guesses, and as we collect more information, obviously we're going to have more answers, but at the moment it is very much we're not really sure. As I said, in terms of autonomic dysfunction, it's not inconceivable. I mean, there are a number of factors that connect both. For example, we know that projections to the insular cortex synapses in regions of the thalamus. So if in fact the thalamus is involved, for example, there's a tenuous link. The thalamic reticular nucleus in particular, we know is especially vulnerable to ischemic damage, so raised intracranial pressure. So again, linking it fairly tenuously with autonomic dysfunction. And we know that the different neurotransmitter systems that are common to both central and autonomic nervous systems are likely involved to some degree. Professor White raised this a couple of weeks ago about the likelihood of one or more neurotransmitter systems being disrupted. You're obviously going to see wide-ranging effects outside of those sensory changes that people with visual snow suffer. What's increasingly hard with people with visual snow is that you find so many sort of oddly associated symptoms. So whether there's any relationship to the visual snow and the associated symptoms or not is really difficult to estimate. Again, it's a little bit too soon, so we're once again taking educated guesses. Okay, number 3. Is the statical snow that we see in our visual field considered a hallucination? This is by Victoria from Delaware. Well, technically, yes. We're assuming that visual snow itself is not actually present. So with any sort of hallucination, we sort of tend to see, or more obviously see, formed images like people and things. But they can be unformed images like scotomas and certainly visual snow. If it's not a hallucination, this suggests that visual snow is what everybody sees, but we're able to filter out. And I think that's probably less likely. I think an interesting connection is that in the context of a hallucination, you find a decrease in thalamic activity and a corresponding increase in activity of the higher order association cortices. There's a bit of a hint that that's what we're looking at. So number 4, is it possible that visual snow is caused by high levels of toxicity in the body? For example, heavy metal poisoning. This is by Michael in Australia, a little bit closer. He's probably listening in the morning. Again, it's actually possible. Mercury is certainly linked to brain changes. I think it's intriguing that this is happening to Michael, but I can't explain it, unfortunately. Visual snow, it's, I guess, maybe caused by a single factor, but that's highly unlikely. It's more likely to be multifactorial or caused by many different things and be triggered by many different things in everybody, basically. What's likely is some sort of predisposition. This may be genetic or maybe not, I suspect so. And then you have some sort of external contributing factor or a set of external contributing factors, and it might be any number of things that disrupts brain function that triggers a sort of deficit or a change in sensory processing in the brain. Okay. Can visual snow be related to concussion or post-concussion syndrome? This is by Vivian in Greece. I don't think there's any direct evidence of a link, but again, it's not implausible. There's certainly a history of concussion in many of the patients that we see. Obviously, that doesn't mean that it causes visual snow by any means. But what's compelling is that we actually don't really understand the brain changes that take place in the context of concussion. The jury's still out a little bit there. So again, it's conceivable. I'm also aware that I keep saying that we don't know, and I do apologise for that. And I think it's really important that that's sort of the take-home message from this series of talks is that we need to understand this better. Unfortunately, as I said before, what we need to help us understand this better is more money. At the risk of sounding like I'm begging for money here, I'm highly aware of the Visual Snow Initiative's CrowdRise, yes, fundraising campaign. I know it's a campaign that's running until the end of November. I know that they're aiming to raise $50,000. They do have a private donor who's willing to commit up to $25,000, dollar for dollar, which is incredibly generous and an incredible contribution to the little research that's being done. We know every dollar truly counts, so I'd urge you to have a look at the website and consider donating to the cause. Like I said, every little bit counts. We're not asking for lots and lots of money, but lots and lots of little pots of money make a big pot of money, and that will make a difference. And all of that money goes directly to research, certainly here in Australia, but in England, as well as the USA. Bear with me. Is there any connection to visual snow and acetylcholine neurotransmitters from Dominic in Czechia? Acetylcholine It's a neurotransmitter found all over the brain, but it's implicated in attention. And the work that I've been doing in particular has been looking at attentional changes in VS. So it's certainly consistent with what we're finding. So the short answer is maybe, to some degree. As Professor White was saying, it's likely, or it's possible, that there's a disruption to neurotransmitter systems, and this may be one of them. Obviously, it's not so straightforward. In the context of neurotransmitter systems, if you have a set of symptoms like the visual snow syndrome, then this is a fairly isolated or localised dysfunction. We're talking about systems that are wide-reaching around the brain. If it was simply knocking out a transmitter system, we'd have sort of basically impact everything we do. The other question raised was about Peter Godesby's 7T. Was he using a 7T? To my knowledge, no, I don't believe he was. I know that the PET-CT obviously isn't an MRI, but he did co-register these images using a 3T scanner, so I think that's probably what he's been using. Another question, can visual snow be stress-related? Absolutely, it can be stress-related. I'm not talking about it causing visual snow by any means, but we know the experience of visual snow is impacted by stress levels. I'd urge you all to have a look at Matthew Renz's videos on this. It's an unlikely trigger, as I said, but the experience can vary. A visual snow, that is, can vary significantly according to current mental state. It's certainly exacerbated by stress and attenuated once the focus is taken away from the symptom itself. Okay. There's also a question about relationship with TOS. Here she's to apologise, I'm not going to attempt to say your name. The thoracic outlet syndrome. It's a syndrome that's caused by compression or injury to the upper chest and lower neck, so it's unlikely to have a direct relationship with visual snow. I'm actually apologising here because I don't think I'm answering your question correctly. I'm happy to do this offline if you like. There's another question here from Jesper from Denmark talking about blue field entoptic phenomenon. This is obviously something that you're all familiar with, at least those of you who experience visual snow, and something that you'll see quite commonly. There are a few theories about this, but the most common is related to blood flow through the eyes, through the capillaries. Capillaries pass over the retina, which is effectively the receptor for light. We know that red blood cells, we're talking about the majority of blood cells, absorb blue light, and as they move in front of the retina, the eye and the brain actually adjust their processing so that you don't physically see dark spots or dark dots. Now, the white blood cells, which are the rest of the blood cells that pass through, actually let the blue light in. So the brain then gets the signal of an increased brightness, and it appears like a moving white light, for want of a better description. This is a normal phenomenon. Why some people are more conscious of it than others, it's really uncertain. We might be looking at some sort of anomaly of visual processing, but it is, in essence, a normal phenomenon. So in your research, have you tried any kind of electrical electrodes between the frontal cortex and the visual cortex? And this is from Mike in California. Short answer, not yet. We're gearing up to do that, and that's part of our process. So we're not just looking at changes in electrical signals. We're actually presenting participants with the same set of behavioural stimuli, the tasks that we're using outside of the EEG and inside the scanner as well. Trying to work out where I'm up to. Apologies. The last of the questions here relates to the possibility of ear infection leading to visual snow and migraines. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, we need to remember that we actually don't know yet what causes visual snow or any of the symptoms that are related to the visual snow syndrome. Anecdotally, or not rather anecdotally, intuitively, it's remotely possible. If you consider something like, if I take the thalamic reticular nucleus, for example, and I'm not saying this is the cause, but I'm interested in finding out if it's not, it's susceptible to damage in a number of ways, and one of those ways is through raised intracranial pressure. It's a bit of a long bow, but if you're trying to connect dots, which is what I do on a daily basis, sometimes you find they lead you down rabbit holes, and I might be incorrect in this respect. That's all the questions that I've been given by you guys. I'd love to hear more from anybody, actually. I work at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I'd love to hear from anybody who has any questions or would like me to follow up on something or clarify something I've said. I'm still not particularly well, so I'm aware that I may have been rambling throughout this presentation. Again, can I urge you to have a look at the Visual Snow Initiative website? Consider donating if that's at all possible. Good luck to you all, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. See you soon.